Hi, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. We're just going to wait a few minutes until more people join us. You see there's instructions in front of you just to make sure to turn on interpretation. Donc, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Nous allons attendre quelques minutes pour que plus de personnes se joignent à nous. Vous verrez sur l'écran, il y a des instructions si vous allez utiliser l'interprétation simultanée. Going to get started just because we want to be mindful of your time and others can join us as we go. So before we get started, if you're going to be using interpretation, here are some instructions in terms of accessing it. You can find it on the bottom right. Donc juste avant de commencer, si vous allez utiliser l'interprétation, voici les instructions à l'écran pour pouvoir y accéder. Vous verrez en bas à droite, vous pourrez cliquer sur le bouton. Juste une note que la présentation complète sera en anglais, mais les groupes de discussion seront en français. Quand vous retournez à la séance principale après les groupes de discussion, vous devez resélectionner l'interprétation. Donc, on vous rappellera, mais juste pour un petit rappel tout de suite. So before we begin, I'm Sally Damashki. I work with the Community Initiatives team of the Canadian Women's Foundation. I work on the Investment Readiness Program. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is presented by the Canadian Women's Foundation, the Investment Readiness Program, Demonstrating Value, and Van City Community Foundation. It's going to be on tracking, expressing your success, and visually demonstrating value. We're really happy to have you with us. And this is the second part of the webinar. It's a two-part series. We have the first part on YouTube, and we'll be sending you the links at the end of this session. So before we get started on our learning journey together, we want to acknowledge that our work at the Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations that we support takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We're very grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, I do want to recognize that a land acknowledgement is not enough. In all that we do, we should make sure that we pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Today, I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation in Ottawa. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and the land that you live on and work on. So today's webinar, as I mentioned, is going to be recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel later. We will be we'll be sharing with you all the information. If you haven't already, as I mentioned earlier, please, if you want to access the interpretation, you can click on the bottom right. And again, as mentioned, if you're going to group breakout rooms. When you come back, you need to reselect the language. If you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A box. We'll be taking questions from our speakers today as we move throughout the session. And if you have any technical issues, we'll do our best to resolve them from the back end. Feel free to write to one of the hosts, and we'll be happy to help you. And if you prefer to write questions to the group, you can also do that in the chat box. You can write them in either French or English, language of your choice, and we will answer you in your preferred language as well. Finally, at the end of the webinar, there's going to be a survey available. So please do take the time to give us feedback. These are sessions that we're adapting and that we are looking to change and make sure that they're addressing your needs. So we really, really appreciate your feedback. So now I'd like to introduce you to our great facilitators for today's session. So we have Kathy with us today, who's been supporting the Investment Readiness Program as well for the evaluation. So she's worked in management and consulting with social economic organizations for over 25 years, balancing her grassroots community work with research and knowledge creation at the national, provincial, and regional levels. And she's a seasoned facilitator, presenter, and adult educator. We also have with us today Garth, who is a communications and business strategist focused on understanding how to manage information to serve the public good. He works with Junction Canada and leads Junction's services development and internal systems and operations. And he specializes in strategic management and impact evaluation for mission-driven organization. So we're very lucky to have Catherine and Garth with us today. They have been very supportive of helping other organizations, including us, to really be able to share more on how to show their impact. And we're really excited to have you with us today. So I will pass on the screen to you.
Great. So we'll just pull up the slides in a moment. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome all of our participants today from across Canada, and welcome back to those that were with us last week. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here today in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. Our thanks to the Canadian Women's Foundation for hosting this workshop series, and for ESDC and Common Approach for funding Demonstrating Value to present it. In addition to our team from CWF, I'm going to acknowledge my colleague Garth Ewell today because he is a board member of Demonstrating Value, and he's going to be pivotal today in helping monitor the chat area, debrief the poll results with me, and step in to further explain points or answer your questions as needed. Before we jump in though, I'd just like to check and see who on this call was able to participate in the last week's session. And to do this, you'll need to go down to the bar at the bottom to participants, click that and press yes or no. There's a little check, green check for yes, and a little red X for no. And this will give me a sense of who's here and who isn't. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute to do that. Again, down to the participants area. Okay, so we've got a number that are new for today. A few returnees. Okay, so we do have a mix, but it's clear that there are some new folks today. So I'll leave it at that and move on. And that will help me just in my recap of what we did last week. Okay, our next slide. We asked you what you wanted to get out of this second workshop, and you gave us your thoughts on this, and lots of them. Here's what you want and need. You want to know how to use the information you collect to demonstrate your impact, your value. You want to find better tracking tools, systems, and strategies. You'd like to discover how to reconcile different data requirements for granting streams and figure out how to share information in meaningful and creative ways using data visualization. You'd like to gain insights about and interpret the data that you gather, and to know what a small organization should focus on and how to prioritize data collection, as well as how to strengthen your grant applications. You'd like info on the best free programs to use. And you mentioned an interest in principles and ethics in collecting valuable and important information. Specifically, some of you are interested in how to collect demographic data across multiple programs with participants, and how you might demonstrate impact in gender-based violence work with urban indigenous agencies, and with youth programming. Finally, you express general hopes that will show you examples, be practical, and provide inspiration. As you can imagine, in this introductory set of workshops, we won't be able to cover all of these in full, but we can touch on many of them. And we do recognize that you're all at different points in your impact measurement journeys. Some of you are just starting out, while others are more advanced and looking for tips on better ways to do impact measurement. So in the breakout rooms and in the chat area, we do encourage you to share what you know with your peers. There may be times when I'll invite you, for instance, to put some information into the chat area. As for the ethics and principles in impact measurement in particular, I can say this. There are ethical issues, including concerns of anonymity, cultural, and safety considerations. For example, we need provisions to ensure Indigenous data sovereignty and to create conditions for ensuring the safety of our respondents and addressing power imbalances between those people whose data we collect and those of us who are collecting and using the data. As well, there are privacy laws to take into account. These are important issues and worthy of much more discussion, though we won't have time to get into this in depth today. If anyone has resources they might recommend on these topics, please feel free to add them in the chat area, and we will revisit this very briefly at the end of our webinar. Again, I'd like to point you in the direction of the Demonstrating Value site, and the URL is on this slide. There's guidebooks and coaching also available for the tools and further supports. The new Getting Started website URL here has some great tips on how to use the guidebooks. We'll also be running a few more workshops as part of the series funded by ESDC and Common Approach. Some of those will be geared specifically to social purpose businesses, and Garth will be running those, and others to not-for-profits, and I'll be running a couple of those. You might want to return to a follow-up session with other team members or refer others you work with to those workshops. Please do contact us following today. Indicate your interest in the evaluation survey that will be sent to you by CWF next week, and or sign up for the Canadian Women's Foundation e-newsletter, where they've agreed to post those workshop dates. Okay, so let's have a look at our objectives for today. Today, we want to introduce you to tools and resources designed to help you figure out what data is most important to collect and how to prioritize data collection. And we want to bring together into snapshots data that would demonstrate your impact and value to others. Here's our agenda for doing this. We're going to start, particularly because some of you are coming on to this workshop having not been at the first, we're going to do a quick recap of key points from our November 5th session. We'll look at metrics data pipelines and the data collection methods and templates that you might be using or you might consider using. We're going to have a look at a tool to help you prioritize data collection. We'll spend some time on snapshot design, the technical considerations, some templates, and give you time to exercise your own design muscles in practice. And we'll briefly touch on data collection systems and how to decide what to invest in. At the end, we'll remind you of some of the key resources you can revisit. Before we get started, can we bring up the first poll? This poll we wanted to look at for those who participated in the first workshop Which of the following aspects of that workshop were most relevant to you? The 3 components of effective membership, impact measurement, excuse me, the common foundations and common approach to impact measurement, developing a clear picture of your information needs, what you want to know and show, identifying indicators or metrics, the peer-to-peer breakout room discussions, the introduction to data snapshots, or something other. Take a minute to do that for us if you wouldn't mind. And we'll give it a minute. Okay, while we're waiting for those results, let's take a quick look at what social impact actually means before we launch into today's concepts. Social impact is the effect on people and communities that happens as a result of an action or an inaction, an activity, project, program, or policy. In other words, it's how what your organization does affects the surrounding community. Impacts can be intentional or unintentional, as well as positive or negative. In this workshop series, we're talking about how to capture and communicate the intended and unintended outcomes, as well as how to monitor what's working and what isn't working to further our social purpose work. Okay, do we have any results on those polls? Let's see. Okay. So definitely developing a clear picture of your information needs seems to be the winner on this one. What you want to know and show. Okay. So we'll follow up from that and we'll talk a little bit about what that means for those of you who were not on the last webinar. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so let's do that recap then. Last week, we talked about why we do impact measurement. That is to help us make good decisions so that we can use our resources more effectively and efficiently to affect the most positive impact results, to intentionally plan and learn from what we do, pivoting where we need to reproduce and scale success and address our failures, and to capture and share our learning as it supports our collective vision for a more just and environmentally secure future. We discussed these 3 components of effective impact measurement that underpin the demonstrating value framework. They're the cogs in the wheel on the slide. Those are clearly defining the information that you most need to collect, developing the capacity to collect that information, and developing your capacity to use that information to further your social mission work. We talked about how to determine your information needs, thinking about the best questions that will help you to decide what you most want to know and what you most need to show to others. We touched on the various kinds of indicators that you might use to demonstrate your impact. Recall that indicators could be data collected through surveys or regular documentation, stories of impact, relevant contextual data such as statistical evidence from research, benchmarks from the field, and/or a combination of any of these. We also reviewed some visual snapshots that organizations created for particular audiences and purposes to see how different kinds of data and metrics or indicators might tell the story of what you want to know and show. And we updated participants on the Common Approach Initiative and how it fits within the Demonstrating Value framework and resources. It was a lightning tour, so if any of these concepts are still fuzzy, let us know in the chat area and we can try to address those questions through this final webinar. The most important takeaway from Demonstrating Value framework is that it calls us to think about and focus on specific uses of the information and the specific audiences to be addressed before we commit to expending a lot more time and resources on data systems, data collection, analysis, or reporting. Maybe go to just the previous slide. The purpose of the information might be needed for, and these are the two charts that might help us understand this. The purpose of the information might be needed to look at your community impact. For instance, when we evaluate a particular social program. They might be used to monitor your business and operational performance. For instance, when we plan and monitor a social or financial performance of a social enterprise. Or it could be used for assessing our organizational sustainability. For instance, when we look at the relative costs of our operation over time and the value of those inputs, given the community, given the value of those inputs, given the community impact we're affecting. The data or information we collect may be directed to audience such as your board of directors to make strategic decisions and to do planning for your organization, or to your staff and engaged partners for planning and making operational and program decisions, or yet again to community members, policy makers, funders, to engage them in your work and provide evidence of accountability and success. So we'll go to the next slide because it talks very specifically about stakeholder engagement. A key practice related to all of the principles outlined in the Common Foundations for Impact Measurement and the Demonstrating Value Framework is the involvement of key stakeholders. Quote, involving these stakeholders can help you identify what is important about your work and therefore what you measure. Involving stakeholders will also enable better data collection, help you to make use of the evidence you gather, and increase the credibility and acceptance of your findings. So plan from the beginning who should be involved, when, and how you will involve them, and what resources you will need. Okay, so let's move on to today's concepts, how to better collect and improve collect information and improve how you use that information. And we'll be starting with data collection. Next slide. Let's assume now that you're clearer about what you want to know and show. That's what we call your information needs, the audiences you might direct it to, and what uses the data you collect will serve. Next, you need to think about when and how you'll collect the information, followed by how you can display it in a way that addresses your objectives. So let's begin here by talking about the metrics data pipeline. One moment, I'm missing one of my talking points sheet, so I'm going to be with you in 1 minute. Every piece of information, data, has a starting point and a destination. Too often, the information we do collect sits in our funding reports, our evaluation reports on our shelves, or on our computers and in our paper files. Much of it stays in our heads. Now, you could probably think about all the program registration data you have, client satisfaction surveys, outputs you keep in databases required by funders, stats collected one time for an event. All of these things and many more may be sitting in your files, or much of it may be just in your head. I tend to talk about some of these things as ending up in data dead ends. Some of it is very useful information and it ends up in data dead ends, and some of it is not very useful information and maybe should stay in data dead ends. So what we want to do is understand how to take the data that we really find useful and make it and bring it to a place where you can use it to effectively know or show what you want, the impact that you have. Excuse me for a minute.
I might add in the overriding concern that I have heard from organizers of social enterprises and nonprofits or others involved in data collection is not that they do not have enough data. It's that they are literally drowning in data. And when your time and attention is perhaps the most scarce resource you have, prioritizing which data deserves your attention is the bigger challenge than simply trying to get more data.
Exactly. And we'll give some examples of the data that you're already collecting in one moment. If you've thought about your information needs, that's what you want to know and show. A good place to start on the next step of your journey is to consider what data you're already collecting, as Garth said, that you may be totally overwhelmed with. But figure out what of that is relevant to your needs and what relevant data others may have already collected that you do not need to collect again, and how you can put this to better use. You might take a moment now to make a note of one priority information need. It could be related to a community impact goal, your operational performance, or program sustainability. Consider a few sources of data that you already collect or research data that you know about that could be used to demonstrate the answers to priority questions about that goal. Keep these in mind for our later exercise on designing your snapshot. This will come in handy. Now let's consider some tools and templates that we might already be using for data collection. Here are some common ones. Staff activity logs, anecdotal records, stories and narratives about an event, an experience, or an individual described by a staff or participants. Documentation in your administrative records related to inventory software, point of sales, audits, reports and minutes of meetings, evaluation forms for your programs, focus groups and interviews, participant journal recordings or knowledge and skills tests with your participants, observation and client case notes, storyboarding and story sharing, surveys, social media monitoring, online registration processes, and other kinds of data. The list really does go on. What we see here is a mix of quantitative and qualitative information. Both can be useful and valid. Much of it can be very unhelpful, but some of it can be very useful and valid. Using a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data can strengthen insights for decision making and reporting by ensuring the limitations of one type of data are balanced by the strengths of the other. It can also be important in allowing you to bring together a human element with numeric data. Recall last time, for those who were here, we talked about the use of research data as well as client and customer narratives, charts, and images in snapshots to provide an overall picture of an impact story. Narratives as well as relevant research and benchmark data can provide important context to the quantitative information you may be collecting. Now let's take a look at poll number 2. We'd like to get a little bit of a feedback from you on what kinds of data you're already collecting. Here's our second poll. Which of the following data collection methods are you already using? We'll give you a few minutes to help us understand this. Okay. While we're waiting, and once you're done that, we'll come back to it. And we'll go to the next slide on templates. Templates support our data collection, analysis, and reporting, and they come in many different formats. You may already be using some of these. Some, for instance, may come with your agency software packages, others such as Excel and Microsoft Access. You can also look for templates on sites that support community, small business, and social enterprise development, and as part of software tools like Google Docs, Survey, Form Builder, and database tools. Here's a small sampling of a range of templates that are out there that may be directly relevant to what you do. I've often used the Toronto Enterprise Fund's cash flow and financial reporting worksheets, for instance, for social purpose enterprises with built-in formulas, and it's an Excel file. Microsoft Access has built-in charitable contribution web databases. The REDF workshop has employment support program tracking tools. Google Docs has sales funnel value and profit calculator. And SurveyMonkey, of course, has a number of templates for surveys, including a 360-degree employee evaluation template. Finally, Airtable has a marketing campaign tracking template that you might be able to use. So those are just a few of the templates that you could access, some of them free or some of them within your existing software packages. Let's have a look at those poll results now.
I think it's interesting to note here that we have well, right away, a lot of people using evaluation forms, not too surprised to use evaluation forms for evaluation. What I find interesting is that the second highest one is anecdotal records, but nobody went with journal recordings. And those two things are very similar to each other, but one is maybe a little more structured than the other. There can be a lot of value in asking people to journal or partake in some form of reflective practice as part of their engagement with your program, as a bit more of a rigorous approach to understanding their thought process and insights than just collecting anecdotal sort of remarks or comments or stories from people.
And quite often I've used observation notes or case notes triangulated with that kind of journaling or direct participant reporting and evaluation forms to see if there's congruence between these and see where we can find the true picture of what's going on in our programming. So that's a great point, Garth. Anything else from this that we can determine? Not a lot of skills testing going on. And of course, social media is right up there now. And I think that's, so many of us are doing so much online work that it's a very, very important time to be looking at who's coming to your online program offerings, how often are they clicking on resources and so on, just to see what activity is going out there that we can't really determine through our face-to-face work with our clients and participants. Okay, thanks for doing that poll. Several of you mentioned that you need to know how you can prioritize data collection so that it's manageable and fit to purpose. How do you sort out the nice to have from the must have? To do this, let's think about what is of most benefit to gather. How important is the information? Consider this from the perspective of all stakeholders who defined the information. Are there things that are logical to do first? Are there things that would be nice to have, but are just not critical? As well, you need to give some thought to the collection challenge. That is, how much effort will it take to develop this data? Do you have a mechanism already in place, or can you develop one easily? What are the time and skills needed to collect, manage, and analyze the information? Will gathering the data be intrusive for participants? Are there language or literacy challenges? And are you trained in the method, or will you need an external consultant or external support in order to collect that data? Recall, for some of you who were in our workshop last week, the example of the Comox Farmers Market from last time. To refresh your memories, they wanted to collect and show data that addressed two priority questions related to their key social impact and business goals. Are we matching customer needs with supply? And how does the market build community? There were several indicators, such as those on this slide, they could collect data on and monitor. But some of these would be more difficult to collect than others, given the resources, and some were less important for decision making. What they ended up with was this snapshot and these priority indicators. In other words, they made decisions about their data collection according to usefulness and manageability criteria. They linked the confidence of customers that they would get much of what they wanted and needed at the market, that's the supply, with the percentage of vendor, or that's the demand, with the percentage of vendors who were in regular attendance providing the supply. And then they considered this along with the customer's relationship building with the vendors and other community members as an indicator of building community and loyalty to purchase at the farmers market. The key indicators showed a model of success for them, or a kind of formula for success. Garth, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on this because you did do work with the farmers markets in terms of how they might have chosen.
Yeah, the priorities varied by market. So we built a toolkit that all farmers markets in British Columbia could use to develop a snapshot that fit their own information needs. There was not sort of a one size fits all view, because some farmers markets were completely financially independent. They made all their money through fees that they collected from vendors. Others relied heavily on funding from a local municipality or a nonprofit funder. And the nature of their business model, I guess, would change for them what things they needed to pay most attention to, or who they were obliged to report to on the outcomes of holding a market each season.
Okay, fantastic. So I think critical there is looking at what your model is and then what you need to know and show that relates to that model and to whom. And so this is an example of one that did do that. The next slide, in other words, the demonstrating value guides contain this simple tool that might help you to prioritize your data collection. This tool is available in Word as well as and the CWF has had it translated, and they're willing to send it out to you after this webinar. Thinking to yourself now about one of your key information needs, what indicators in data collection approaches would you prioritize? Which are most important and easiest to get, for instance? Which ones are least important that you can direct to your data dead end? And those that are really important but may be challenging to collect, for these you may need to prioritize staff time or agency resources and possibly get outside help. Garth, do you have anything more you want to comment on this particular prioritization?
There's three things that I'd add here. One, like I mentioned, for farmers markets, importance of information is not just how important is this to you, but should take into consideration how important is this for funders, supporters, other stakeholders, your beneficiaries, to make a decision about whether or not they want to support you. So second is we can often collect data because it's easy and it's right there, but this comes with an opportunity cost that it's taking up time that you might spend on collecting something that's more valuable. So I think using this sort of prioritization can help you feel comfortable saying, you know what, actually, we're not going to bother looking at the number of views of our social media posts because we're not, we don't have good insight into who's looking at them and whether or not it matters. It's just a vanity metric. We're going to spend our time looking at something else. And third, I'd say it's when we say what is the collection challenge here, is it easy, feasible, or difficult? It's very easy to assess that for our own effort, but we should not discount the unpaid labor or emotional labor of the program beneficiaries or the other stakeholders that are providing information to us. And I was thinking of that based on Candace's comment in the chat where she said, like journaling could be very personal for some of the people that we serve and they wouldn't feel comfortable doing this. And so we have to think, well, if that was information that we really needed, are we accounting for the level of supports that we would need to provide to address the personal nature of sharing that we're asking for and put adequate, safeguards around that so that people are not feeling abused by our process.
Those are great points. Thank you so much, Garth. We'll move on now then to consider how to improve and how to use the collection or the data that you collect, starting with some templates and considerations for creating your own snapshot. So here we go. The next slide, demonstrating value, has a variety of templates on the website that illustrate different visual ways to show information you collect. Snapshot templates may be dashboards highlighting different objectives you have and data that reflect your progress on key indicators. They could be challenge solutions, formats that present data related to the core issue you're focused on, demonstrating what happens if you don't address this challenge or what might be happening without your intervention, and show indicators of your progress in addressing the challenge. In other words, your solution to the problem. They might be impact snapshots that are thematic, that are visual depictions of progress indicators related to different impact areas that you may address in your work. These may be environmental, social, cultural, and may be appropriate from multi-service agencies or enterprises, for instance, that focus on environmental goals at the same time as doing employment development, such as recycling social purpose enterprises. Past, present, and future templates show data on past performance or baselines before you started an intervention, present data showing progress in the here and now, and then a future vision featuring data and information on where you're headed. On the previous slide, I just want to point out the couple of templates that are there. That's fine. There are these templates. One is the dashboard, which you see on my left, showing key indices and a place for program narrative. And this is where we've said you can use different, even if it's a dashboard, it can include a narrative component to provide explanation and context. And the second, our impact, is a challenge solution template that outlines a mix of text and data graphics that summarizes the challenge you're addressing in your project or programming, with some really neat ways of demonstrating data that are much more visual. These two samples in particular are on the Demonstrating Value Getting Started website now. They're available in Word format for you to download and enter your own information.
I would add to this that this is not intended to necessarily be a complete standalone communications tool that tells somebody every single thing they need to know about what you're doing. I usually advocate for people to use a snapshot like this, not as I'm just going to email this to somebody in lieu of talking to them, but saying this is a conversation aid. It helps you talk somebody through what you do with a visual support and with some numbers beside it that helps somebody who's not familiar with what you do, or maybe not familiar with the issue area or your business model, to help see how the pieces fit together. So there's always a tension in constructing something like this to have just enough information to support the story that you would tell when you're using this, but not go so far as that you're trying to put everything that you might say while you're presenting this on the page.
Yeah, great point. Well, let's take a look at that next snapshot, because it was done with, it's not a snapshot, it's a snapshot that was done with Demonstrating Value on an interdisciplinary program for frail and homebound seniors. It was called, and is called, House Calls. You'll find them on the net. In the visual here, you see a description of the mission at the top of the program and the challenge, that is the urgent needs that this program aims to address. Next, we see key evidence on the benefits of the program, why keep seniors in their homes with support, why keeping seniors in their homes with support is really important. It shows convincing program data on the reduction of hospitalizations and the reduction of days in hospital when those hospitalizations do occur, as well as the cost effectiveness of the program. Finally, the snapshot is a call to action. And so I think that's on the next page, the next slide, showing the need for increased resources for preventive programs like house calls as the population in Canada ages, and the possibility of expanding or replicating the model to continue to reap the benefits of this approach for seniors, the community, and for the government and other healthcare investors. From this example, you can see how effectively data that is collected can be used for policy advocacy, for seeking investment and support, and to raise awareness about the issues. And as Garth has said, I reiterate, it is one tool in a tool belt, and your conversation with those audiences that you're addressing it to will be key in order to make the use of this tool effective.
Yeah, and this particular snapshot for this enterprise came out of the Green Shield Canada Foundation's social enterprise program. Green Shield is a social enterprise insurer based in Toronto. And at first glance, there's a lot of very impressive contextual data in this snapshot around like what is the cost of home-based care and what are the results in hospitalizations and hospital days of care and so on. And House Calls did not do all of the primary data collection for that. Catherine said early on in the presentation, think about who else is collecting data so that you don't have to. Because they were partnered with the hospital, they arranged to have a lot of this data come from the hospital. They could say, can you tell us 1 month to the next for this panel of patients that we're serving, what is the difference in their days of care versus the population? So somebody else was doing the data collection and they were able to work with the institution to extract a summary and use it in their snapshot. So very savvy on their part to have very high quality data, but a really low effort on their part compared to the effort of trying to track that information themselves.
Excellent. Okay, so far we've looked at what information you want to know, how you might want to collect that information, and a few tips on how to prioritize data collection. We've looked at some templates for visualization and the House Calls example of a very effective snapshot. Now's your chance to begin designing your own snapshot of what you want to show. For this exercise, we'll ask you to simply sketch out content ideas first, design it with indicators that are available to you, and those you can develop or access fairly easily. If you don't have the data right away, enter placeholders and you can adjust it later. For each section, think carefully about what you want to convey. Beware of presenting data for the sake of presenting data. Rather, group and relate information to make it meaningful. This means thinking about the decisions the snapshot audience will be making and about the clear messages you want to convey about your value, including what makes your model unique or differentiates you from another program. For this, you can use figures, numbers, text, stories, even multimedia like video and photos to communicate your message. Think about how you present it so that it can provide maximum insights for your audience. Remember, data and figures can be more powerful if you provide some text for your audience to interpret them. We're going to go into the breakout rooms shortly, so take a moment to write down these questions for your peer sharing exercise. What is the key focus of your snapshots and what's its scope? Who is the key audience for your snapshot? Are there others? And what are up to 3 messages and/or sections you might include in order to address the audience you're trying to address? We're going to ask you to give each person in your breakout a chance to tell you about how they might shape their snapshot. Don't forget to think back to the what for, the story you're trying to tell and what you want from your audience. There'll be about 3 or 4 people assigned to each workout room or breakout room, and we'll check back with you in the main webinar room in 20 minutes. So give each person about 5 or 6 minutes after introducing yourselves to think out loud about your snapshot. I'm going to pass it to Michelle. Yes, Garth?
I'm going to just say,
yes.
I'm going to add a bit because
Sure.
I just grabbed a marker and a paper and I imagined doing this for what Kathy and I are doing today. So I quickly sketched out a little snapshot, but like, how would I show that these are great workshops? I'd show, here's our participation rising over time. Here's bios for Kathy and I. Here's the satisfaction rating from everybody. And here are the main things that people learn and why that's important. And I did this because what I was thinking about, the thought exercise I did was, if I was sitting across the table from a funder and I said, I want you to fund us to do this workshop 50 more times, what do I want to have on the sheet that's on the table between us?
Yeah.
So this is what you're doing in this exercise. Think about who's across the table and what you want on that sheet between you to tell that story and put some numbers with it.
Great example. Okay, and a very visual a way to describe it. So Michelle, I wonder if you could break everyone. We'll give it a minute for everyone to come back online, or those that are still with us. If you're just coming back online and you have just a second to go to the chat area, if there's anything that you found particularly interesting about that exercise, helpful, challenging, maybe just plop something in the chat area so we can have a quick look, and we'll have a few minutes to debrief. We don't have a lot of time because we're coming to the end, but if you have some feedback, that would be great. Anything entered? Not as yet. We just asked those of you who are back if you have any feedback or reactions to that exercise to use the chat area to let others know, let us know. Okay, so people are learning about what's going on from other people in their breakout rooms. Thanks for saying that, Doreen. Anything else that people found challenging about the task or enlightening?
Well, we have Hannah saying she was intimidating at first, but when she got started, she found a groove. Good ideas.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like people are enjoying sharing with each other.
Okay. Okay, got some great information. All right, well, let's move on. We may have time again at the end even to unmute and have some questions or comments. So we're going to go on to the next slide and talk about some of the tools, the other tools that you can use to show your data. Okay, we'll pull up that slide now.
There we go.
There you go. Okay. So of course we've talked a little bit about some of the program softwares that you use pretty much daily. They may be Microsoft Word, Excel. You can also be looking for templates in reporting software like SAP's Crystal Dashboard design. Here are some other softwares you might consider. Microsoft Google Docs. I think it's on our next slide now. Canva, which is one that Sally in particular at Canadian Women's Foundation recommended. Adobe Illustrator, of course. Pictochart, which I think was the basis for the 2 Word templates that Bryn at Demonstrating Value is supplying on the website, Getting Started website. Venngage, Easily, Tableau, ClickData, Zoho Analytics, Looker, iDashboards, and CSense. So there are many and many more rolling off as we do a lot more work online, rolling off the presses. You can also, if you haven't already, please do check out TechSoup Canada for any support in purchasing software for your nonprofit at very deeply discounted prices. It's really worth looking for it. But again, before you do, think about what you really need to know and show, and then do a bit of research on what's available out there for you. Before we close today, let's talk a bit about building data collection into existing processes, systems, and or creating new systems for data collection. Data collection, we know, is integrated into many processes and systems that we use already, including point of sales, websites and digital media, human resource management, scheduling, contact management, just to name a few. So knowing how to access and use this data can be a good starting point if you want to develop better systems for data collection, retrieval, management, and reporting. Many software solutions, some of which we've already noted, allow you to add custom fields and to export data and enhance reporting through third-party reporting software tools. Sometimes you'll need to collect new data or create new systems for collecting data. It's wise to think through different options and to ask people within and outside of your organization who would be involved in collecting and using the data for their input. Look before you leap on this one. One of the biggest success factors in implementing new data collection systems is buy-in from frontline staff, particularly for ongoing monitoring. While strong leadership is important, frontline staff are the ones who actually fill out the forms and keep the records. They need to see the benefit of accurate data collection practices. Be sure to choose a method that's manageable, both in terms of the time involved, expertise needed, and the financial resources you have. If you're in a position to consider building some new information systems and improving on what you already have, consider what you need, what you already have that needs improving, whether different systems can talk to each other and whether they're integrated, and can you layer impact data collection into any of these? I don't know if you have any examples of this, Garth, in terms of, I can give a story, but you perhaps have one that's, I think you're still muted.
Sorry about
There
that.
you
I don't have a particular story in mind. My general advice is just the best system is the one that you know how to use.
Okay, and I'll give a very particular example, because as I was writing this, I realized that we'd gone through this with one of my clients. This is an experience, in my experience as a social enterprise consultant doing business and sustainability planning with a provincial network of cooperative and nonprofit childcare centers and nurseries. We knew that the long-term ED had a really good handle on using Excel to document her member list, dues, timing of payments, etc. She didn't do the fancy stuff. She just knew how to use Excel for basic data entry. We also knew that her dues were based on the number of kids in care in the centers. So she had data already on budget and size of each member. And she knew which ones access certain benefits of membership, such as the insurance or employee benefits package. What she didn't know was how to make decisions about growing her membership and how to target her marketing, given that she was the only staff member and had over 60 members. In speaking with her, we learned she spent a lot of time working with the smaller centers, not the larger centers, and they were paying the least amount of dues. We also learned that the ED did all the marketing calls each year prior to billing and following her membership year. And we knew that she was spending far more time than she was paid and accumulating a lot of overtime. So we had a number of issues that she was facing. We decided what would be most helpful is to use her Excel spreadsheets to document the amount of time she spent on phone troubleshooting with members over a 6-month period before her marketing calls. And we just developed a script, or an interview script, for instance, for her marketing calls with questions that explored the services members were using, which they weren't, why, and whether the center itself was growing or in trouble. With this information under her belt, and after these few months of documenting, we were able to determine a marketing and outreach strategy that focused on retention of the largest members through programs that would help them save money. So it kept them there, and market the network to mid-size and larger organizations that would ultimately bring in additional dollars to enable the ED to spend time with the smaller centers that needed the help most. We also recommended that she do limit her time in spending phone consultation with smaller centers, not to give everything, to avoid her excessive overtime so she could be retained as the ED, that she didn't burn out. And they decided on putting a number of their materials online so that some of the centers could access them without her help. The point of the story is this very small organization did not have to purchase a new large database. They didn't have to hire a high-priced consultant. They simply needed to build on what they were already using, collect some additional key data from members, and take the time to interpret the data and make strategic and operational decisions about the use of time, marketing, and membership goals. So that's a little story about how you can use what you have and just build on it. You're likely already spending a lot of time on, and human resources on, data collection. The question here is, can you make it more efficient? And that was a story about how we tried to make it a little bit more efficient. And is it feasible given who will be engaged in collecting and monitoring it? So we just ask you to think about the return on investment for new systems. Again, Garth, if you have any feedback on this, I know a lot of people in organizations that have gotten databases built and then they didn't do what they wanted them to do, and it was a very difficult road for them. Any particular advice before we go on to our final poll?
To just spend 90% of your time on establishing what your requirements are for a system.
That's it.
And 10% on the actual specifications and implementation.
Right on.
It's so important to think really deeply about the users of the system and what information they need to make decisions. And I'll pick that out of one of the comments here in the chat. Hannah said, I found it challenging to decide what information to include. You can go and ask your funders those questions explicitly. What information do you need from us? And start with the end in mind and work back from there, so that you're not, sort of like Kathy's just said in that story, so that you're not developing a giant database to pull information that you don't necessarily actually need, or that's not extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Having that clear sense also helps you advocate on your own behalf to funders who may have information demands where you don't necessarily have to just sort of roll over and accept them at face value. Funder may say, well, we'd like to know this, this, and this, and you could come back to them with alternatives and say, would it be good enough if we could tell you these things instead? Because if you want to know these things, we have to get a database, and that's going to cost a lot of money. And are you going to pay for that? Those are conversations you're allowed to have, and going through the thinking of who needs what and how important is it and where can you get the data and what's involved in collecting it. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, thinking about the end-to-end data pipeline, working through that on paper before you commit yourself to really building it really helps you make better decisions about where you're going to spend time and energy on working with the data.
That's fantastic. Well, in that, that's a good segue. Why don't we look at the final poll for today?
Oh, well, yep.
And this poll is going to look at some of your data collection challenges, so that we can kind of end by, if we have a couple minutes, looking at what's most on your mind. And so to answer these questions, please rate yourself according to whether you strongly agree to strongly disagree related to the question. While we're waiting for you to do that, I'll just speak sort of in the background and come back to the point about privacy and ethics. We talked about how important ethics are in data collection, and that's very important to me as an evaluator as well. We know we couldn't go into much detail, but a particular note, we wanted to comment on the First Nations Information Governance Center, home to the First Nations principles of OCAP. OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. It means First Nations control data collection processes in their communities, and that First Nations own, protect, and control how that information is used. There's a website here, I guess on the, can we pull up that slide with the website URL? Yeah, for OCAP, it's right there. Any data collection done through universities with students as researchers may also be subject to ethics guidelines and protocol of those particular institutions. Garth mentioned last time that using university students to do marketing studies or literature searches can be really, really helpful. If it becomes research, it may be subject to the ethical guidelines of that and protocol of that institution. And finally, consider your privacy laws when you're thinking about data collection and sharing that data. Okay, let's look at any results we do have from the poll before we close out today.
Floating entity, lost between two land. This story is about the.
Okay. So Garth, and if you wouldn't mind helping me with this, looking over.
Yeah, I'm just looking over here. Definitely seeing people in agreement about it being time consuming.
Yeah.
I mean, the questions here just reflect the sort of common pains that we hear from organizations around the challenges of working with data. Mixed reaction on different versions of the same files. The data are messy. I'm just looking through here to see if there's any other ones where there was a clear. We know that's just some things that could make our lives easier, but we don't have time to figure it out. There was some strong agreement on that one, and consensus on just that it's time consuming. So yeah, I'm seeing the clear consensus here is around the challenge of just the amount of time it takes to do this work, perhaps less so than the technical challenges, and that's where that prioritization grid can help. Anything that can help you spend less time or focus your effort, not collect information that's not absolutely needed. Those might be the things you want to look at first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our webinar, so I'm just going to close it out with a final reminder that many of the resources and tools we've talked about now and last week are on the Common Approach website and the Demonstrating Value work website, including their Getting Started online pages, dvtools.org. We'd like your help with data collection, so please, please, please do consider filling out the feedback survey that's coming out from Canadian Women's Foundation next week. Look for it in your inbox, and thanks once again for participating. Thanks to CWF, Demonstrating Value, and all the rest of them for making this workshop series possible. I was going to ask Sally if Sally's there. Is Sally with us? To close us out with a request to do a bit of a chat waterfall.